If you think you know how complicated family relationships can get, wait until you hear what happened at my daughter's wedding. What started as the happiest day of our lives turned into a moment that would change everything forever. Before I tell you this story, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. You won't believe how this ends. My name is Robert Chen, and I'm 58 years old. I've been working as a mechanical engineer in Detroit for the past 30 years, raised two beautiful children as a single father after my wife passed away when they were young. My daughter Sarah is 28 now, and my son Michael is 25. What I'm about to tell you happened just 3 months ago, and I'm still processing everything that unfolded. Sarah had always been the apple of my eye. After her mother died in a car accident when Sarah was only 8, I devoted my entire life to making sure both my children felt loved and supported. I worked double shifts, saved every penny for their education, and never missed a single school play, soccer game, or graduation. Michael and I always had a straightforward relationship. He's practical like me, works in IT, and we talk regularly. But Sarah was different. Creative, emotional, and sometimes distant in ways I never quite understood. For the past 5 years, Sarah had been dating James, a lawyer from a wealthy family in Birmingham, Alabama. When they got engaged last year, I was overjoyed. James seemed like a good man, respectful, ambitious, and clearly devoted to my daughter. However, I noticed that whenever James's family was around, Sarah would become tense and sometimes make strange comments about her childhood that didn't align with my memories. The first red flag came during the engagement party at James's parents' house. It was a beautiful southern mansion with white columns and perfectly manicured gardens. James's mother, Patricia, was the epitome of southern hospitality, but I could sense she was studying me carefully. During dinner, Sarah mentioned how difficult her childhood had been and how she had to overcome so much. I was confused because, despite the tragedy of losing her mother, I had worked incredibly hard to provide stability and love. When I tried to join the conversation and share some happy memories of Sarah's childhood, like the time we built a treehouse together or her piano recitals, Sarah would quickly change the subject or give me sharp looks. James's father, William, a prominent judge, seemed particularly interested in Sarah's stories about growing up without much support and having to raise herself after her mother died. Over the following months, as wedding planning intensified, I noticed Sarah becoming increasingly distant. Phone calls became shorter, visits less frequent. When I offered to contribute to the wedding expenses I had been saving for years for this moment, Sarah brushed off my offer, saying James's family was taking care of everything. The message was clear. They didn't need my help. The rehearsal dinner took place at the country club, where James's family held membership. The venue was elegant, with crystal chandeliers and waiters in white gloves. I felt out of place in my best suit, which suddenly seemed inadequate next to the tailored tuxedos of James's relatives. During the toasts, James's grandfather, a distinguished man in his 80s, stood up and welcomed Sarah to the family. "We're so proud to welcome Sarah into our family," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "Despite everything she's been through, losing her mother so young and essentially raising herself, she's become such a remarkable young woman. It takes real strength to overcome a childhood without proper guidance and support." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Sarah avoided my eyes as the room applauded. Later that evening, I approached her privately, my voice shaking with hurt and confusion. "Sarah, honey, what are you telling these people about your childhood, about me?" She looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with her engagement ring. "Dad, it's complicated. James's family, they have certain expectations. They understand struggle, but they also value independence and self-reliance. But you weren't alone, sweetheart. I was there. We were a team." "I know, Dad. But sometimes it's easier to let people think what they want to think." Those words haunted me all night. I barely slept. replaying every interaction, every strange comment, every moment when Sarah had rewritten our shared history. The wedding day arrived with typical Michigan spring weather. Overcast skies, threatening rain, but holding off just long enough for the outdoor ceremony. The venue was a historic mansion in Bloomfield Hills, rented for the occasion by James's family. White roses and peonies decorated every surface, and a string quartet played softly as guests arrived. I wore the new tuxedo I had bought specifically for this day, and despite everything, I felt proud walking my daughter down the aisle. She looked absolutely radiant in her grandmother's restored wedding dress, my mother's dress, which I had kept preserved all these years specifically for this moment. As we walked down the petal-strewn path, I whispered, "I love you, sweetheart. Whatever's been going on, today is about your happiness." She squeezed my arm, and for a moment I saw my little girl again. "I love you too, Dad." The ceremony was beautiful. James's vows brought tears to everyone's eyes as he spoke about Sarah's resilience and how she had overcome adversity to become the strong, independent woman he fell in love with. Sarah's vows were equally moving, though I noticed she kept glancing nervously toward James's family section. After the ceremony, during the cocktail hour, I was mingling with guests when I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. James's Aunt Margaret was speaking to his cousin about Sarah. "I just think it's so inspiring how she's risen above her circumstances," Margaret was saying. "Patricia told me that Sarah's father was basically absent after her mother died. Drinking problems, couldn't hold down a job. The poor girl had to work to support herself through high school and college. No wonder she's so independent." I stood frozen, a glass of champagne trembling in my hand. This couldn't be real. I had never had a drinking problem. I barely touched alcohol. I'd worked the same job for 30 years, had been promoted multiple times, and had paid for both my children's college educations in full. James's cousin nodded sympathetically. "At least she found James. Patricia says they're planning to help her reconnect with her father now that she's in a stable situation. Apparently, he's been trying to get back in touch, but Sarah's been protecting herself from disappointment." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Not only had Sarah portrayed me as an absent alcoholic father, but she had positioned herself as the victim who was graciously allowing me back into her life. The man they were describing bore no resemblance to the father who had attended every parent-teacher conference, worked overtime to afford her dance lessons, and held her every night when she had nightmares after her mother's death. I needed air. I stepped outside onto the mansion's back terrace, overlooking the manicured gardens. My hands were shaking as I tried to process what I'd just learned. How long had this been going on? How many people believed this fabricated version of our family's story? "Mr. Chen?" I turned to see James approaching, his expression concerned. "Are you feeling all right? You look pale." This was my moment. I could confront him, tell him the truth about his wife's lies, demand that Sarah explain herself to everyone. But looking at James, this young man who clearly loved my daughter and was starting his married life, I hesitated. "James, can I ask you something? What has Sarah told you about her childhood? About me?" James looked uncomfortable, loosening his bow tie slightly. "Well, she's mentioned that things were difficult after your wife passed, that you struggled with some personal issues and weren't always present. But she also says you're doing better now, and she wants to rebuild your relationship. And you believe that version of events?" James studied my face carefully. He was a lawyer, trained to read people and situations. "Mr. Chen, is there something you need to tell me?" Before I could respond, we were interrupted by the wedding coordinator announcing that dinner was being served. James gave me a long look before heading back inside, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the weight of a decision that would affect not just me, but my daughter's new marriage. The reception hall was decorated like something from a fairy tale. Round tables draped in ivory linens, centerpieces of white hydrangeas and roses, and soft lighting that made everything glow. I was seated at a table with some of James's extended family, people I had never met, but who seemed to know all about Sarah's difficult upbringing. During dinner, James's grandmother, Elizabeth, a sweet woman in her 80s, leaned over to me. "Robert, I just want you to know how much we admire Sarah's strength. Raising herself essentially alone after such a tragedy, it speaks to remarkable character. And we're so glad you're working to rebuild your relationship with her." I smiled politely, cutting my salmon into smaller and smaller pieces, my appetite completely gone. "She's always been strong," I managed to say. "Patricia mentioned that you've been sober for a few years now. That must have been quite a journey." The words felt surreal. Sober. I wanted to laugh, but it would have sounded hysterical. Instead, I nodded non-committally and excused myself to the restroom. In the marble-appointed men's room, I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection. This was my daughter's wedding day. Whatever issues we had, whatever lies she had told, this wasn't the time or place to blow up her new life. But how could I continue to sit there, listening to people congratulate me on overcoming problems I never had, while my actual sacrifices and love were erased from the story? When I returned to the reception, the toasts were beginning. Michael stood up first, and I held my breath, wondering what he would say. "I've had the privilege of watching Sarah my entire life," Michael began, his voice steady and clear. "She's always been creative, passionate, and sometimes a little dramatic." The room chuckled. "But what I want James and his family to know is that our dad has been the most devoted father anyone could ask for. After Mom died, he could have fallen apart. Instead, he worked multiple jobs to make sure Sarah and I never went without. He drove Sarah to dance classes an hour each way, 3 times a week for 6 years. He helped her with college applications, celebrated every achievement, and has always been her biggest supporter." The room fell silent. I could see Sarah's face from across the room. She had gone completely pale. Michael continued, "Dad taught us that family means showing up, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Sarah, I know you've been through a lot of changes lately, but I hope you remember that the foundation Dad built for us is solid. It's something to be proud of, not something to run from." He raised his glass. "To Sarah and James, and to the power of truth in all relationships." The room erupted in applause, but I could see the confusion on some faces. James's family was exchanging glances, clearly trying to reconcile Michael's speech with the story they had been told. James stood up next for his groom's speech. As a lawyer, he had clearly caught the subtext of Michael's words. "Thank you, Michael, for those beautiful words about family," James began carefully. "Sarah has told me many stories about her childhood and her family. Some have been complicated. But what I've learned about love is that it's not always perfect, and sometimes we protect ourselves by creating narratives that help us make sense of difficult emotions." He turned to look directly at Sarah, then at me. "What I know for certain is that Sarah is the most remarkable woman I've ever met. And Mr. Chen, seeing how proud you are of her today, and hearing Michael's words, I'm beginning to understand that love takes many forms. Sometimes we need distance to appreciate what we've always had." James raised his glass, his eyes still on Sarah, who was now visibly emotional. "To truth, to love, and to the families that shape us, in all their imperfect perfection." After James's speech, I noticed Sarah excuse herself from the head table. I waited a few minutes, then followed her outside to the garden where we had taken photos earlier. I found her sitting on a stone bench, her elaborate dress spread around her like flower petals, tears streaming down her carefully applied makeup. "Sarah." She looked up at me, and for the first time in months I saw my real daughter, not the person who had been performing for James's family, but the young woman who used to curl up next to me on the couch when thunderstorms scared her. "Dad, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I don't know how it got so out of hand." I sat down beside her, careful not to wrinkle her dress. "Tell me what happened, sweetheart. Help me understand." Sarah took a shaky breath. "When I first met James's family, They were so impressed by successful people, by stories of overcoming adversity. His mother kept talking about how wonderful it was that James was dating someone who had pulled herself up by her bootstraps. It felt like they saw struggle as something noble, but only if you conquered it alone. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I started exaggerating little things. How hard it was after Mum died. How independent I had to become. They ate it up. They loved the idea that James was saving this strong, self-made woman. But Sarah, you didn't need saving. You were never alone. I know, she cried, but somehow the story got bigger and bigger. When I tried to backtrack, to include you more in the narrative, it felt like I was admitting I had lied. And then James proposed, and his family was so invested in this version of me. I didn't know how to take it back. I put my arm around her shoulders, feeling her lean into me, the way she used to when she was small. Sweetheart, why didn't you just tell the truth? That you had a father who loved you and worked hard to take care of you. Because, she said quietly, I was afraid they wouldn't think I was special anymore. That story, the one where I overcome everything alone, it made me seem stronger, more interesting. The real story where I had a loving dad who sacrificed everything for his kids felt too ordinary. The word hit me like a slap. Ordinary. 30 years of devotion, of choosing my children over everything else, of building a stable life from the wreckage of tragedy. Ordinary. Sarah, do you know what I gave up for you and Michael after your mother died? She shook her head, still crying. I was offered a promotion that would have required relocating to California. Better money, better opportunities. I turned it down because I didn't want to uproot you kids after you'd already lost so much. I dated exactly 3 women in 20 years because I was afraid of bringing anyone into our lives who might hurt you. I drove a 15-year-old car so I could afford your college tuition. None of that felt ordinary to me. Sarah was sobbing now. Dad, I never meant to diminish what you did. I wanted to be impressive to them. You are impressive, Sarah. Your creativity, your empathy, your drive, those things come from who you are, not from some fabricated story of hardship. And they certainly don't come from being abandoned. We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of the reception continuing inside. Finally, Sarah spoke. What do I do now? How do I fix this? Before I could answer, we heard footsteps on the gravel path. James appeared, followed by his parents, Patricia and William. Their expressions were serious, but not unkind. Sarah, James said gently, I think we need to have a conversation. Patricia stepped forward, her southern accent soft but firm. Honey, we've been talking with your brother Michael. It seems there might have been some miscommunication about your family situation. Sarah stood up, smoothing her dress, and took a deep breath. Actually, there's something I need to tell all of you. What happened next was one of the most difficult but necessary conversations I've ever witnessed. Sarah, with remarkable courage, told James and his family the truth. The whole truth. She explained how the lies had started small and grown, how she had been afraid of disappointing them, and how she had ended up erasing her own father from her story in an attempt to seem more impressive. James listened without interruption, his lawyer's training serving him well. When Sarah finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Sarah, he finally said, I fell in love with you, not with your story. The woman I married today is kind, creative and strong, not because she survived abandonment, but because she was raised by someone who taught her how to love and be loved. He turned to me. Mr. Chen, I owe you an apology. And more than that, I owe you gratitude. The woman I married was shaped by your love and sacrifice. I'm sorry that my family's assumptions put Sarah in a position where she felt she had to hide that. Patricia stepped forward, tears in her eyes. Robert, we are so very sorry. In our family, we sometimes get caught up in our own ideas about what makes people impressive or worthy. We should have taken the time to know you and to appreciate the obvious love between you and your children. William, the judge, extended his hand to me. I'd like to start over if you'll let us. We'd be honored to truly welcome you into our family, not as someone Sarah has graciously forgiven, but as the devoted father who raised the remarkable woman our son loves. Standing there in that garden, surrounded by the truth finally spoken aloud, I felt something shift. The weight I had been carrying all day, all these months, began to lift. I appreciate that, I said, shaking William's hand. All I've ever wanted is for Sarah to be happy and to be loved for who she really is. Sarah came to me then, wrapping her arms around me in a hug that felt like coming home. Dad, I'm so sorry I made you ordinary. You're the most extraordinary father anyone could have. You never made me ordinary, sweetheart. You just forgot for a while that ordinary love, the kind that shows up every day, that works overtime, that never gives up. That's actually the most extraordinary thing of all. We returned to the reception together, and James asked the band to pause for a moment. He took the microphone and addressed the room. I want to share something with all of you, he said, his voice clear and strong. Today has taught me something important about truth and love. Sometimes we think we need to be more than we are to deserve love, but real love sees us exactly as we are and chooses us anyway. He gestured towards Sarah and me. Sarah's father, Robert, has shown me what unconditional love looks like. He raised 2 incredible children as a single parent, worked multiple jobs, sacrificed his own opportunities, and never asked for recognition or credit. He's been here all along, loving Sarah through every phase of her life, including the phase where she felt she needed to be someone else to be worthy of love. The room was completely silent now, so I want to make something clear to everyone here. Sarah didn't pull herself up by her bootstraps. She was lifted up by a father's unwavering love and devotion, and I am honored to join a family built on that foundation. James raised his glass one more time. To Robert Chen, father of the bride, and to the love that never gives up. The applause that followed was different from the polite clapping earlier in the evening. It was genuine, warm, and full of understanding. People came up to me throughout the rest of the night, James's relatives, family friends, even the string quartet, to shake my hand and share their own stories of parental love and sacrifice. But the moment that meant the most came near the end of the evening, when Sarah and James were preparing to leave for their honeymoon. Sarah found me by the dessert table, where I was talking with Michael about the unexpected turn the day had taken. "Dad," she said, still in her wedding dress, but with her hair loose now, looking more like my daughter and less like a Southern belle. "I have something for you." She handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a watch, not expensive but engraved with words that made my breath catch. "To Dad, for being there every hour of every day. Love, Sarah." "I bought this months ago," she said quietly, "before everything got so complicated. I always knew who you really were. I just forgot for a while that that was enough, more than enough." I hugged her then, this beautiful woman who would always be my little girl, and whispered in her ear, "It was always enough, sweetheart. You were always enough just as you are." As I drove home that night, through the quiet streets of Detroit, I reflected on what had transpired. My daughter had spent months rewriting our family's history, turning me into a cautionary tale instead of a love story. But in the end, the truth had a way of surfacing, demanding to be heard and acknowledged. The weeks that followed brought changes I never expected. James's family, true to their word, made genuine efforts to include me and get to know the real story of our family. Patricia called to invite me to their lake house for the 4th of July. William sent me articles about mechanical engineering innovations, showing real interest in my work. Most importantly, Sarah and I began to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of complete honesty. We talked about her mother's death and how it affected her differently than it affected Michael and me. We discussed her fears about not being interesting enough, smart enough, accomplished enough for James's family, and slowly We both learned that the truth of our love for each other was far more compelling than any fiction she could have invented. 3 months later, as I finished telling this story, Sarah is happily settled into married life. She and James bought a house just 20 minutes from mine, and she calls me every Sunday, the way she used to before the wedding planning began. Last weekend, she brought James over to see the photo albums from her childhood, the real story, told in pictures of dance recitals, family vacations on a budget, and bedtime stories read in the treehouse we built together. James, looking through those albums, said something that will stay with me forever. "Sarah, this is so much better than the story you told me before. This is a story about being cherished." That's what I want everyone to understand from this experience. Love doesn't need to be dramatic or tragic to be profound. The quiet, daily acts of devotion, making breakfast, attending school plays, working extra hours to pay for opportunities, holding your child when they're scared, these aren't ordinary. They're everything. Sarah learned that she didn't need to be a survivor of abandonment to be worthy of love. She was already worthy, had always been worthy, because she was raised to understand her own value through the unwavering commitment of someone who chose her every single day for her entire life. And I learned that sometimes the people we love most will hurt us in ways we never expect, not because they don't love us, but because they're fighting battles we don't even know about. Forgiveness isn't just about pardoning the offense. It's about understanding the fear behind it and loving the person anyway. If this story moved you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their love, whether they're giving it or receiving it, is extraordinary just as it is. Because sometimes the most powerful truth is the simplest one. You are enough exactly as you are. And the love you give and receive doesn't need to be dramatic to be beautiful. It just needs to be real.